I start out in my own reflection of thinking when I experience grief, and I actually realize that it's almost a part of daily life, experiencing grief in some form, either revisiting loss in life or other things. And I certainly think, you can't watch the news without experiencing grief. And when it's deepest is when we see individual faces or individual stories, like Sandy Hook, which still upsets me every day, or the Twin Towers, where I knew people, or hearing their names like Breonna Taylor or George Floyd, knowing individual stories. The more individualized it is, the more personalized it is, the deeper we feel it, but it also is has the most impact in terms of goodness. I have a poem here that I'm going to read, Indra's Net. It's a Buddhist poem. This is one I have gone to when I've had loss in my life. There is an endless net of threads throughout the universe. At every crossing of the threads, there is an individual, and every individual is a crystal bead. And every crystal bead reflects not only the light from every other crystal in the net, but also every other reflection throughout the entire universe. What my realization is that when we can see the crystal beads, then we also experience their connections. And it makes people matter. I mean, it means we're part of something very important. And it's up to the rest of us when we lose someone to find that importance. For me, grief is loss. I've lost many people in my life. And I've been thinking of a few of them in particular. And I thought, firstly, of two students of mine who died that impacted me greatly. One had a defective heart and died at the age of 8. Her name was Libby. Another was Tim, who I had throughout his elementary school. So I was his teacher for his entire elementary school. And he died at 25 when he was in graduate school. And I felt it keenly because he was like one of my own children. And he died because he was riding his bike, getting ready for a fundraiser for troubled youth. And he was hit and dragged by a drunk driver. So it was very, very troubling, very hurtful. Of the friends and relatives I've lost, I think last year was particularly hard because I lost both my older sister and my younger brother. My younger brother was quite recent, so I still feel the grief and I'm working through that. Part of the goodness was people helping me work through that. First Presbyterian Church, really, they helped me a lot with their prayers when he was ill, when I knew he was ill, and I still hoped he might succeed in battling what ended up being terminal cancer. The scriptures help. The classic 23rd Psalm, which I first heard when my grandfather died. That was the first death that really impacted me. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. And I think that's, what I did feel. I felt that with my sister and brother, that particularly I felt that my faith was really, really helping me to process their grief and to decide what I was going to do with it, what my role was. Comfort was also in the celebration of life with my brother. People, some of whom I've never met, talked about how he touched their lives. And I thought this was some of the goodness that came out of it too, to know how people connect, how those crystal beads reflect on each other. Weaving of memories, I think that's a really important part of grief. And with my brother, I went to Australia. My sister and I went to all his favorite places, talked to all the people that he knew and interacted with daily. We were motivated to carry on some of his work. He was an educator. He and I designed some courses together, which I taught in America and he taught in Australia. that's then what we focused on after weaving these memories. It was, how can we keep going? How can we keep touching the lives of people that were touched by him? And then I got to thinking again back to Sandy Hook and the Twin Towers and the church in Birmingham and all of these things where I felt grief. And I thought, the whole process of laying flowers and sharing, and it gives the strength. I mean, the action that's come out of Sandy Hook, this work against guns, the work against white supremacy, the work for democracy, it is coming out of that. I mean, that's some of the goodness that's coming out of this terrible grief as a country. In the case of my students, for Libby, we planted many trees, practically a forest, as every child planted a tree. It's a metaphor, but it's also goodness. It's a beauty where, she'll go on, and even though she had a very short life, she had an impact. She had an impact on each child who planted a tree in her name. We'll never forget her. And she had an impact on the environment. And for Tim, a huge amount of money was raised through bike rides for his charity for vulnerable youth. So that was goodness that came out of it.
It strikes me in kind of all these examples that you're sharing that this act of embodied grief and shared grief pulls out the goodness as flowers are laid, as trees are planted, as you carry forward Tim's memory with work for youth, and your brother's memory through your education work, that the goodness of their lives is being brought forward and pulled out through kind of that embodied work.
One of the courses I teach is developmental psychology, and I've always been influenced by Erik Erikson. His 7th stage of life, he called generativity versus stagnation. If we achieve generativity, we're seeing ourselves as a small but very, very important part in an ongoing life. That we see our actions, looking after children, linking to the community, as impacting generations to come. And if we don't see ourselves like that, then we stagnate and ultimately go into despair. And I think maybe that's part of this whole exploration of grief and goodness, that ultimately we are going to die, and what goodness will come out of our lives. So that's another part of my reflection. How am I impacting the community so that as a small bead among a multitude of beads, that there'll be some goodness going on.